This is the Widow Podcast, and I am Karen Sutton, the Widow Coach. I'll be supporting you through the loss of your life partner so you can find a more positive way through your grief. I want to give you hope after loss and to know that when you are ready, you can create a meaningful life for yourself with the help of me, Karen Sutton, and the Widow Podcast. Hello and welcome back to the Widow Podcast. I have a lovely, wonderful, amazing guest for you today. I'm really excited for this conversation. Slightly different to our usual conversations, but today I am talking to the lovely Jess May. Jess is a funeral celebrant based down in Brighton on the south coast, and Jess is not a widow, as my usual guests are, though Jess does have her own story. But what I love about Jess is her completely unique way of approaching funerals. And I think there's so much that we can do now with our funerals and even exploring things like living wakes. And I think they're really important conversations to have. Now, I know a lot of my listeners have lost their person, but I also know that I have listeners that haven't lost their person and may be caring for somebody at end of life. And sometimes just understanding your options and what's out there can be really helpful, and it can open up conversations. So please listen with an open heart, an open mind, and I think you'll really enjoy this conversation. Jess is wonderful. So Jess, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
I just couldn't be more honoured. I'm so excited about it. I'm just beside myself and I can't wait to tell everybody all about it. It's just brilliant to get an excuse to chat about the things that you love the most and that are your biggest passion. So I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you.
Oh, bless you. Thank you so much for being here. So let's start a little bit with your story and how you came into becoming a funeral celebrant. It's not your average job, is it? And I suspect there's a story behind it, Jess.
There are a lot of people that say that to me. They say, "What do you do?" And I recently said, "Oh, I create funeral ceremonies." And this person just looked at me and said, "That's a bizarre job." And I thought, well, it is a bizarre job, but I suppose I'm so used to doing it now that I don't think of it like that. I got into being a celebrant through being doing weddings, but the reason that I did the wedding in the first place was because my niece was the daughter of my late sister. When my late sister was dying, my niece wanted to get married, and my late sister was a really powerful character. And she was determined to have a big white wedding and all the big scene and the church and the traditions. And my niece wanted something very simple and sort of bougie and small. And in the end, they called me as a compromise, and I ended up training to be a wedding celebrant. And then my sister subsequently died a year later. And I was involved with doing her funeral. I left it 3 years and then decided to train to do funerals because I had so many people say, "Oh, you must do it. You'd be so great." And it wasn't really something that at the time I felt able to do, because I think, and your listeners will know this, if you've had a profound bereavement, and I subsequently had my father and my mother die a week apart. No, my father and my sister, they actually died a week apart in the end. And my mum was already dead. And I just had a lot of mourning to do. And it takes a long time to get to a point at which you feel safe to work with other people's grief. So whilst my grieving experiences fed into my career and inform my work hugely, I did also have a history of working in hospice care and loads of support work. So there's a big trajectory, really. When every one of you that's listening will have this, you'll look back on your life and you'll think, I completely understand how I've ended up here doing what I do. And it just made the most of everything and all of my experiences. So that was the start of it.
Wow. So much loss as well, Jess, and in a short amount of time, and how lovely now that you are able, I guess, to turn that pain into purpose and do something where you're able to give back and create moments for others that feel memorable and meaningful. I think it's probably the kind of job where you have to have that purpose and that feeling for it, don't you? Because working around grief and death, it's a very sensitive area, isn't it?
I think this is true. I spoke to someone today who is planning to be a funeral celebrant, and I was saying to her that I still get really emotionally involved with my people. And I have heard funeral directors and celebrants say to me before, oh, you just have to get to the point where you're emotionally detached. And Karen, that is literally never going to happen to me. So I had to decide I either am going to do this and expend huge amounts of emotional energy every time I work with people, or I'm going to work in a shop, and there's nothing in between for me. That's not to say that I don't have to look after myself, but I really do think from my own experience, it's the people with whom you don't have to explain. They're the people that really, really help. And the people that
Mm.
don't say the stupid things because they've had them all said to them before. So
Yeah,
I think my pain does inform my work. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And I can only imagine just how amazing you are at it. So just to start then, what's the difference between a funeral director and a funeral celebrant?
Funeral directors were traditionally called funeral undertakers because they undertake the work that you do not want to be doing when you're in grief. All the admin, the ordering of coffins, the carrying the coffin, the booking the venues, the deciding, all of the things that are so difficult to make decisions about. That's how it started. And also, when somebody dies and you need that person taken away, they do all of this. But when they shifted sort of during the Victorian times to being called directors. And for me, I think that was a real shame. The undertakers I worked with in Birmingham, and they're amazing, they're called a natural undertaking, and they remained undertakers. They never called themselves a funeral director because funeral directors are not there to direct your funerals. They're there to undertake the jobs you don't want to do. And as soon as we start calling them directors, then they start taking away your autonomy and they start controlling things. And that's not at all what
Mm,
they're really there for. And a funeral
mm,
celebrant is someone who celebrates. That's what it actually means. We celebrate life. So we will be the people that will go to your home and sit and hear your story. And then we will go to the ceremony and we will create the ceremony with you. And then we will lead the ceremony on the day or facilitate the readers and the everything that happens in the event.
So the funeral celebrant often is sort of attached to the funeral directors, and that's how people often find a celebrant, isn't it? If they're not using a religious path, I suppose, in terms of a priest or a vicar or something. Do you have to use the celebrant that is recommended to you or provided by the funeral directors that you choose?
Well, I'm very glad you asked me that question, Karen. No, you don't. And I think when you're in grief, it's so draining, isn't it? And it's so exhausting that what tends to happen is someone will turn up wearing a pinstripe suit, perhaps, and say, these are your options. And as part of the options will be coffin, coffin handles, and person to do the ceremony. And if you say you don't want a vicar, you'll just get handed a list of maybe 2 or 3 people and told these are the people we use. And chances are, because you're tired and you have so many decisions to make, you'll just say, oh, we'll go with that one. Thank you very much. And you might not even look them up.
Yeah.
Funeral directors tend to have people that, like all of us, they work with particular people that they have a particular connection to. You could call them favorites, or you could just think, well, they have a good working relationship and that works for them. Celebrants charge quite a range of different prices from £200 up to £550 or even more than that, because of the value that they offer and the type of work that they do. But with a funeral director, because they've had to standardize their prices, they've capped the price on all the people that they work with. And usually that's at about £220, which means that a lot of celebrants can't really work with funeral directors anymore because we can't earn a living.
Mm.
But you will be offered people that they know that work within a particular price point. And if you want something different, or you want someone more colourful, less solemn, less formal, and you know that you want a particular person for the person who died who would just resonate with them, you do have to look on directories or look online in your local area for the right person.
That's really interesting, actually, because I remember when Simon died, and I, went to my funeral director, and from what I can recall, we were just given a celebrant. I don't remember being given options, and I quite liked her, actually, but my mother-in-law didn't, and it's something she still feels quite strongly about, I'd say. But like you say, when you're grieving and you're just being handed all this information, it's hard, isn't it? It's hard to understand what your choices are, because there's so many things going on.
Yeah. And often
I
if
know.
you're sorry,
No, go on.
if you're a family of four, if you're from a family of four, you will know this. You're not likely to have everything in common with your siblings. So I quite often will have four people with four different opinions about the kind of celebrant they might like. And I think sometimes it's just easier for people to go with the one that the funeral director said they had to have.
Yeah.
So that might be what happened with you and your mother-in-law, that you're different people.
Yeah, just go with it and hope for the best. It's difficult, though, isn't it? And is this something that you can think about and choose before you die? And I know that's not always possible. Simon died suddenly, so it wasn't necessarily something we were preempting. But I know for a lot of people, they are living with a life limiting illness. And is it there a time in that where you can start to think about your funeral and who you'd like to do that for you?
So I am really passionate about this particular area, and it is increasingly popular to celebrate your own life before you die. It's not for everyone. But I have also worked a couple of times with people who I remember really clearly. I mean, you become very close with them. They called me and said, I'm organising my own funeral. I'm concerned about X or Y when I leave. I don't want them to have to deal with everything when I die. Will you come and meet me and meet them, and we'll discuss about what we want to do? And this guy that I met, he was amazing, and he was a carpet designer. He'd done all of his life. He'd been creating these really colourful carpets. And then when he was 40 years old, he decided to only ever wear black and white, and for the rest of his life. And he was 75 when he died. He'd seen some inspiration with a rock star somewhere who did it, and he decided that was it. He was done with colour. But he ended up having black roses on his coffin, and it was a white coffin.
Wow.
And he was brilliant. And so I sat there with him and his family, his sons in the conservatory. And I remember to this day seeing his pipe collection, hearing all about how he loved smoking all his life. And he did, in fact, die from lung cancer. But he said he had no regrets, because for him, that was just his hobby. I mean, we all have our opinions about that. But he was such a strong character, and he had such a strong idea about who he was and what he wanted. And the lovely thing about it was, when I went to the funeral, everybody knew me already. So nobody needed introducing, no one needed anything explained. We got everything written before he died. So it was all there, and he had a chance to veto it, double check what was being said, and he loved it. And I remember his wife saying, I'm so pleased because he loved you, and that he chose you and he loved you. And that was brilliant, just knowing that he had that. And the other woman I'm thinking of in particular, amazing person, she had a sister who was feeling very vulnerable about everything. And she chose all her music, all the new romantics, ABBA, the whole lot, and exactly designed it from start to finish, exactly what she wanted. So that's one way in which you can collaborate with people before you die. But there are other ways as well, which I'm really excited about and exploring increasingly. So, and something I'm specializing in. So living wakes are something you can have. And if you think about this from the viewpoint of the traditional Irish wake, which would take place around an open casket, probably in a pub, and traditionally even actually in the pub on the, you know, on the tables there. And it would be, everyone would be having a whiskey and everyone would be telling a story with the person there. And if you think about a living wake, you just need to think about the living person being there and having a drink and a chat and telling stories while you're there. So it can be an opportunity to say goodbye to people, get them all in one place, eat, drink, be merry. And another way you can do it is to have a living funeral, which shouldn't really be confused with a living wake. A living wake is more informal. The living wake is you're attending your own wake, and the living funeral is you're attending your own funeral, which can literally be in the crematorium or in a venue, let's say. It won't be in a crem, but in a venue with the chairs set out and people standing at the front and someone conducting it as they would, leading the ceremony, saying the poems, reading your eulogy as though it was a funeral. So they're
But you're
quite
there.
distinct, but you're there.
You're there alive.
Mhm.
Okay, so it's essentially your own funeral, but
Literally your own funeral.
before you've
Yeah.
died.
Which I think is probably for me, it's slightly harder to get my head around than having a living wake, which is more like a gathering. And it can be coordinated by someone like me, but it's just a little bit less formal, I guess.
So why would somebody choose to have either of those options? What's in it for them?
Well, you will have heard people saying, we're not having a funeral. We're just not having one. Now, what you or I feel about that isn't irrelevant, but it doesn't really change the fashions. So people are saying that. And for me, that's really sad because I know the genuine healing power of hugs and love and conversation and storytelling. But people aren't having them because they're expensive. They're not having them because they don't want to feel depressed, because they don't like crematorium, don't like funerals, they don't like depressing things. So if your person doesn't want to have a funeral but you still want to do something, then this is kind of an in-between option. It's something you can do. So there's something in it for those people and families who still want to celebrate, but they just don't want funerals, they don't like them. There's also arguments for having these living funerals when your people live all over the world and you want to get them all in one place. And they're probably going to come over for the funeral and they're going to be there for the funeral, but you won't be there. So
Mm.
people are saying, and there's a real shift in theology and philosophy and the world view around death in the Western, well, particularly in white British culture, has shifted to such an extent that largely people don't believe in life after death. And so they're going for secular funerals. And that's really what's shifted. The mindset is, well, I might as well do it all before I die because afterwards will be a waste of money, a waste of time. If they're all going to have a party, then I want to be there. If they're going to have a funeral, I want to hear what they're going to say about me. So it just gives you an opportunity to use that occasion to, yes, to grieve and yes, to try to start to heal, but also to say goodbye and see each other one last time.
Interesting. That is because they say, don't they? There's a quote, and I can't remember it verbatim. You might, but there's something along the lines of you're never as loved, or you're never as good a person as the person that you are at your funeral. It's something like that, isn't it? Because obviously at your funeral everyone just says the most amazing things about you, and you are just godlike. Untouchable. Everyone's just the best version of themselves, aren't they, at their funeral? But you're not
I think
there, and
that's
it's like, well, I want to hear all that.
that's a really good, really, really good thing to say. I saw an article I think it was in The Guardian, and the headline was, I had a living wake and I didn't realize how much I was loved.
Yeah.
And there was something about that. I mean, she had a big full on party, but there was something about that really got me, because to think that before you die, you have a realization of how deeply you are loved
Yeah.
feels
How
to me like a
wonderful.
really precious thing for you and a really precious thing for those around you. to make sure
Yeah.
that your person knows how loved they are is
Because I
really
hear it.
powerful.
It is. I hear it so often in my communities, my membership and my program, just people saying, they regret not saying certain things. That they question whether their person knew how loved they were and what they thought of them. And especially when you're maybe nursing somebody end of life, it's hard emotionally, physically, spiritually. Like it's just hard, isn't it? And you can become a bit snappy, a bit intolerant, and it's not always that loving between you because of the circumstances you find yourself in. Everyone's tired, just completely exhausted on so many levels, and there's always that, "Oh, I don't know if they knew how much I love them. I wish I'd said more. I wish I'd done more." And actually, I think it's important to remember what you did say and what you did do, because it's very easy to think about what you didn't say and didn't do. And I think there's a lot that you have done that makes them feel loved, but to have the opportunity to do something like that and say the things you want to say to them whilst they're still here would be a truly wonderful gift, I think, for both parties, knowing that everything that you wanted to say has been said. And like you say, just knowing how loved you are when you leave this earth would be such a comfort and such a wonderful thing to take with you. So I can completely relate to that. And I think that's just such a truly beautiful thing to do for somebody, if you have the opportunity, I suppose, to do that, and you have the time to, to create that space, I suppose, that not everybody does. But
That's true.
what
There's a beautiful poem, isn't there? All the poem, and it ends with, all I need is to be loved, and to know that I'm loved in all the earth. I forget, one of your
oh,
listeners will know it, but it's beautiful. And I think it's true. I think for me, that has a resonance to it. And there are so many different ways. So this is the thing. You have the opportunity to do this beforehand, and you have the kind of sensibilities in your family where you can approach the subject and you can do the thing. Or you have a sudden death where you don't have those choices. I think sometimes people think, I didn't say it when I needed to say it. And they think that there's no opportunity to say it now because it's
mm,
done. And I
mm,
would argue that there's a real place for memorials, and we could get onto that later, but maybe a year later, when you've found all the right people and the right words and you've settled and you've managed to take a breath, that's a really good time to do it. And historically, that's something in the Jewish faith that they always do. But going back to the doing something beforehand, I mean, it's my biggest passion at the moment, and I'm really researching it. So I'd be delighted if any of your listeners wanted to get in touch with me and would come and help me to find out about what people need, because I just really want to meet the needs of people that are out there,
mm,
rather than try and prescribe to them what they do or don't want. So it would
mm,
just be really interesting to hear from your listeners. But the thing I'm doing at the moment that I'm working on is gathering people together to write their story together. And I would go away and write it and bring them a keepsake book that they would keep forever. And going back to what you said about worrying that you are not saying the things, you haven't said the things, everything's been so stressful, all that you said, it's so true. And so I think there's real value in just setting aside 3 hours where all the stress, as best it can, is just put on hold. And you
mm.
can eat, drink, share photo albums, share your videos, listen to each other, tell the funny stories, have a bit of a cry, and do it in an informal way, whether it's around the bed of someone who's dying or in the back garden over sandwiches. I don't know, whatever you want to do, but just pausing everything. And there's something very special about boundary time and intentional time for gathering. And if you gather people very specifically and intentionally for that moment where you can share your love for a person, even say you're sorry for being short tempered, you then know that you've done it and you've said it beforehand, if you have that choice. So I think there's real
I love
value in
that.
it in that way. Yeah.
That's so beautiful. I think you're right. Just like you say, to pause time and to be in a moment. Life is so busy, isn't it? And there's so much expected of us from ourselves and from people around us. And we can get lost in the noise and in the things that maybe don't matter so much. In the moment they feel like they do, but when you reflect back, you kind of go, I was focused on the wrong thing. And we've all done it. We've all been there. It's very easy to do, but I love that notion of intentionally crafting that time to be to be together, to share, to laugh, to cry, and to remember, and just be in that moment with the people that you love and have created those memories with. I think that's just something you can never, money can't buy that stuff, can it? You know, like that, those are the things that matters, that they're priceless, and you take those things forward with you, and you treasure them. um I kind of want to talk about how people open up these conversations with each other, but before we go on to that, if you are to have a living funeral or wake, whatever you decide, and do something like this, what do people then do when they actually die?
I think this is a really, really interesting question. And if anybody out there has any answers for us, I'd be delighted to hear from you, because I think there'll be many and varied.
Mm.
The most recent conversation I had as part of my market research, and I'm fascinated by it, and it's not uncommon. Young woman died, and they knew she was dying, had a living funeral. They called it a living funeral. They had actually had the living wake, big celebration, big party, speeches, all of that. Then they had a funeral, which I think was intimate. So they had a lot of people there. Then they had this intimate mourning thing with maybe 10 people really, really close to her in a chapel. I
And
think
she
she had
was
a
there for that
church.
as well.
She was
Yeah.
there for that. So
Hmm.
so she was alive for that one. And then after she died, they went to the funeral and had a traditional funeral, but with very few people. And then after that, they had a memorial where they had conversation and like a reception afterwards, which was so they sort of had it that way round, which is the traditional way that you would have at the wake, the funeral, the reception. So it was really following a very traditional format, an old-fashioned way of doing things. But they did all three. And I think there is real value in doing all three. It's like before, middle, and after. It's preparatory, it's present, and it's future, sort of planning for the future. And that's what the reception does, is move you forward into your new and altered reality with your community.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Interesting, actually, isn't it? Because you would think that doing a living funeral, living wake would replace the actual funeral, but it doesn't. It you can do both. It's just
It
allowing you to.
can. I mean, sometimes it does. The people that I worked with that I mentioned earlier, they wanted to meet me for preparatory reasons, to prepare for their own funeral when they were dead. And there are people who, increasingly, people don't have funerals at all. This is very common, and I think
Mm,
it's a real shame. So we mentioned that, but I think the living funeral does sometimes replace. It does sometimes do away with the traditional funeral, but it doesn't have to, I think, is the point.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, you're right, as you say there's so many people now that are moving away from wanting a funeral. My mum's recently announced, not, I mean, she's not terminal or anything, but she's decided that she doesn't want a funeral because they're a waste of money. And actually, myself and my sister are quite angry, is a strong word, um, but we're not cool with it, do you know? Because for me, a funeral is an opportunity. It's part of the grieving process, and yes, maybe society has made it that way, and you could argue it could be different, but for me, I think to have the opportunity to say your goodbyes, and part of the processing of the fact they're no longer here, they're no longer living. You know, how do you mark that if somebody says, I'm not having one. I don't want one. You know, and actually I think, and from actually listening to our conversation that we're having, I feel maybe I'm shifting on this a little bit because it can very much be about the person. But for me, a funeral after somebody has died is very much about the people that are left behind, as opposed to the person, because it's part of the grieving. It's being able to say goodbye and start that grieving process, and to have that taken away from you just doesn't sit right with me, and I feel really uncomfortable about it. But would I go against my mum's wishes, you know,
Oh, no.
and do one when she doesn't want one, because then you've got that conflict. And it's hard. I can understand why people don't want them, because they are so expensive, aren't they? They're thousands and thousands of
I mean,
pounds, and people.
they don't have to be. I mean, it's being put out there by these marketing companies who are marketing direct cremations, which will be what your mum is finding. But
Mm,
she's got that idea from somewhere. We all get
mm,
our ideas from somewhere, and there's a huge marketing campaign. You only have to go online to look up direct cremations, and you will see hundreds of companies who are telling you they can offer you a low cost funeral because funerals are so expensive. But you know what? They don't have to be. They don't have to be £5,000. You can
mm,
do all kinds of things. You can have a cardboard board coffin. You can have no flowers. You can have all kinds of different ways in which you can cut costs, which don't, I mean, you can even have it in your back garden. You don't have to use a funeral undertaker. You can, or an
can
undertaker, a
you?
funeral director. You can do all kinds of things. But the point is that she thinks it's a fuss about nothing. It's a waste of money. And these are the beliefs that are in our culture now. I'm with you, obviously, because it's my job and I love what I do. I have seen so many people come in one state and go out in another, and I believe in them. I believe that cultures and communities have grief together for a reason.
Mm,
I'm not happy with an individualist society that doesn't allow people to collect in order to grieve. And there's a big question for me about whether people are being told that they can't afford funerals, or whether we're living in an economy where people can't afford them. It's not that they don't want them, they can't afford them. And that's not the same. And I don't want people to go without funerals because they think they're a waste of money and I don't want them, when what they're actually saying is, I don't have enough money to buy one. So I
yeah.
think they vary, and you can get something as low cost as sort of £890 if your mum goes with what she's planning. But what's sort of devious about these direct cremation adverts is that they're saying, you don't want to be a fuss. You don't want to make a fuss for your family. You don't want to be a burden to your daughters. You don't want to use all their inheritance. Don't do that. It's all bad. So she unwittingly is depriving you of an opportunity to say goodbye and to honor her and to process, because she thinks she's doing you a favor by preventing you from having to go
Mm,
through I don't want her to go through that. I don't want to be center of attention. I don't want to waste all that fuss about nothing. Um, Ironically, you want to do something, and then there's all these questions around, how do we honor our dead? Do we actually have to be obedient to people when they've died? I don't know that we do, but we have a concept that in order to be proud, to do them proud, we must honor their wishes. But if those wishes are really holding you back in your healing, you might have to find a way around them. I'm not saying go all out and have a big no fuss funeral, but you might want a big fuss funeral. But you
yeah.
might want to do something like have a tree planting ceremony or a memorial with someone like me after the event, if they're absolutely insistent that they won't have a funeral. But I'm with you all the way, really.
Yeah, 'cause it does. It feels like you're being robbed of your goodbye, because that's essentially what you're doing. And I don't want to be robbed of that. And yeah, maybe you have to pay for the pleasure, but I don't know. I kind of go, well, that's okay. That's what feels right. But you're spot on there, Jess. It does come down to, well, I don't want to be a burden. I don't want them to have to spend the money. But it's not about that, is it? It's so much deeper than that.
It
And it's
is.
very easy as the person to say, no, I'm not doing it. But is that fair on the people left behind? It's like, yeah,
I
it's a
think if
tough
it's
one.
dictated by the person who's dying, I suspect it's not fair. I had
Mm,
an amazing funeral, the cake wake that I told you about, where they had like a bake-off thing for the funeral. Now, that person, I'm still very friendly with her, decided that she wanted a direct cremation way before it was a cool thing to do, before it was fashionable, because she absolutely hates crematoria and she'd had a really traumatic experience in a crem. And she didn't want her young sons to have to go through her experience in a horrible building, freezing cold, miserable. So she organized something that was really, really different with an open mic and a coffee cart, and that was something you can do with ashes. So if you do have a direct cremation and you end up with, you have the ashes of your person and you don't quite know what to do with them, having a celebration of life with the ashes present is a really, really great thing to do. Now, she chose that for herself, for her sons, for her healing, because for her, that was a better option. At the time, before I worked with her, I had real opinions about it. I was on my high horse. By the time I'd finished it, I thought it was absolutely fantastic and it totally changed my experience of direct cremation. But I do feel that if your mum is dictating to you from beyond the grave that you can't grieve, it's out of order. It's a
Yeah,
very
it's
different
hard.
thing. It's
I know. Try telling my mum that.
Oh, it's pointless. They're all like it. There's this generation, a whole generation of people that are absolutely convinced that it's
Yeah.
morally right to tell you that you don't have to grieve. Yes, it's a whole
Whole
thing.
other conversation.
Yeah.
It's mad, isn't it? But I'm interested there because you said about having a funeral, and you said you can do it in your back garden if you want to, and I think this is where we fall short, isn't it? Because I don't know if anyone else listening, but my concept of a funeral is done either in a church or in a crematorium. Like I didn't know that you were able, if you wanted to have it somewhere of your own choice. I mean, how does that work? What are your options?
Well, I mean, it's pretty unlimited. If you don't, if you're not causing public offence, and by that I mean if you're not carrying somebody fully exposed along the road. Um, Obviously, you have somebody who's dead and you're carrying them along, and everyone
Yeah.
can see that this is a dead person. That can cause public offence to some
Okay.
people. And so there's a general consensus that you should cover a person's face if you're carrying someone in public. That's it. So you
Wow.
can take your person and you can take them pretty much anywhere. You wouldn't go to a public place, really like a public shopping centre, or sit in the park
Mm,
necessarily, but
mm.
it's not against the law to go
Wow.
anywhere.
You-
And it's
That's
not against the law
amazing.
to bury. Yeah, I know. And it's because funeral directors for such a long time, and I know lots of fantastic funeral directors and undertakers. They do a fantastic job. They take the burden away from families. They're committed. They're passionate. And I'm
Mm,
not dissing them. But the funeral industry has taken on, particularly the monopolies, have taken on this role that's sort of dictating to people what they
mm,
can and can't have, or what is and isn't normal. So there's no real information out there to suggest that you don't need a funeral director. But for example, if someone in your life dies and you want to have the funeral in your back garden, and if you get permission to bury them and you put on the deeds that you're burying this person in your garden and you own the property, as long as you put it on the deeds, you can bury them in your back garden. They need to be clear of a waterway because of polluting water. You can bury someone in a shroud. You can bury them in a felt blanket. You don't have to. Well, you don't have to really have it in a crematorium. You can have it in a. There's a local barn near to us now, and they're doing funerals and celebrations of life. And this beautiful ancient barn, which is so warm and inviting and beautiful. It's so soft and sometimes I think some crematoria are really nice, but in the main, they're quite sterile buildings, and quite
mm.
often they're modelled on, because a lot of them are Victorian or post-war. That there's this whole sort of they sort of took off again post-war, but they've got these very sterile spaces that are still half chapel and half not. They didn't really know what to do with their architecture, so they had these churches, and then they thought, we're not doing church anymore, but we must have a cross and an altar, and we must have pews. But so often you would go to a space that can seem quite alien. I would imagine if you're very young and you go to a crematorium, you won't really understand that space. Um, and with wedding celebrations, you wouldn't go to a space that you didn't find beautiful. So you can go to, I've done them in community centres, Quaker retreat centres, big wedding venues. There's a place called Highbury Hall in Birmingham, which is open for funerals. And increasingly, wedding venues are diversifying and opening up for funerals. So you can have them there and you don't have to have hymns. I heard the other day of a funeral director who had said, right, this is what you need. You need to choose 3 pieces of music, you need to choose 3 poems, and then you need to just, that's it, call the celebrant. So I get this call from someone who's already been told what they have to have. I start with a blank page with people, and I will encourage you to have exactly what you need. 9 times out of 10, that isn't 3 hymns and 3 prayers or 3
Mm.
poems. If you're not literary, you don't want poems. If you're not into music, you don't want music. So it's like everything else. I had one ceremony once for a woman who's a good friend of mine now, and we read out an email from his best friend, and that was all we did. We stood at the front. I took out this email, and it started with, "Well, Steve, this is a shit situation." And I just read it through. And the reason why she chose it was because it said everything anybody would ever want to say, all in one go.
Aw.
And then we played a bit of music and left. I've done funerals in festival spaces. I've done them in open markets where I did one where, for a David Bowie fan who was obsessed with, he had a music shop called Swordfish Records in Birmingham, and everybody knew him as Gaz from Swordfish Records. And there's, permission to share that. And he had a bus behind him in this. When we went to the funeral, we took the funeral cortege in, we took the person in, and behind we had this bus covered in faux fur. It was like yellow and black zebra fur. And all his pals decorated it, and then they all came to the front and read a bit here and there, but it was mainly just wall-to-wall David Bowie, and then everyone had a curry. It was brilliant. So you can have anything you like, really. You don't have to do any of the things that you think you have to do.
I love that. That's
Yeah,
it
it's
sort of
good.
makes me think about my own, what would I want to do for my own funeral? Do you
That's
know? It's
such a good
like,
question.
yeah, and it kind of gets you thinking, doesn't it? Because it's like, I probably wouldn't want to dictate it too much because I do believe it's about the people being left behind. But I equally think it's quite nice to know a little bit about what the person would want because, when Simon died, he died suddenly. And as much as we'd spoken about what we would do after each other died, and we did have those conversations, we never really talked about our funerals and what we wanted. So when Simon died, I was just completely confused and conflicted around what to do. And of course, you've got everyone's opinions around what would be right and good to do by him. And I just was like, I have no idea. And I think actually what we did, if I was to ask him, he'd go, that would be far from what I would have.
And
But
that's the one thing
he's
that's
not there
good.
to ask.
Sorry. Yeah, well, that's
No, I
the
was
one
just saying
good
he's
thing
not there.
about asking in advance, isn't it? That
Mm,
if you had that opportunity, or if someone had said to you, "This is what I want," one thing I will say for that is it does prevent all kinds of arguments and fallout because you just say, "Look, it's written down." Just
yeah,
as something that I would
yeah.
recommend. I co-founded a thing called Coffin Club in Brighton. It's part of a national initiative raising awareness around all of these freedoms that we have, the freedoms of choice. And we advocate having a funeral wish list. And it doesn't have to be like, it's not legally binding. You don't
Mm,
have to have it. But it says on it just the kind of music you might like, whether or not you want flowers, where you want the charity money to go to, what sort of venue you might
yeah.
like, whether you want religious or you don't. And it does make things easier for people. And I think that's the difference. What your mum is doing is denying your own choice and not
Mm,
listening to your own needs. And absolutely,
mm,
funerals are for those who are left behind. But what is good is if she'd said, look, these are the things that I'm not comfortable with that I would prefer you didn't include, but I understand that it is for
mm,
you. Could you
yeah,
please make sure that you don't do X and Y? And I would love it if you do this. And I
yeah.
think that's just a really good balance.
guidelines almost,
Yeah,
just to help you make those choices and decisions that feel good for both people. It's amazing, isn't it? I think, society, we have this whole belief system, don't we, around grief and death and what that should look like and how we should be doing it. And what I love about you, Jess, is just you're really breaking the mold. You're really sort of standing out from the crowd and going, do you know, you don't have to do it like that. There are all these other options, and you help people understand what they are. And I know you go and you spend time with people and you have the conversations, which I can only imagine, just working with some of the ladies I work with, that how difficult it is when you know somebody is dying. And specifically, some people, when they know they're dying, that they don't want to talk about their death because, they might be in a mindset of, I'm not dying, I'm going to live. Or I know it's happening, but I don't want to talk about it. And so then it's very difficult to bring up those conversations. But I can imagine bringing someone like you into that situation makes it a little bit easier for everybody, because you will guide them, you will ask the questions, it just helps that free flowing conversation, maybe,
I think
that
so.
people find very
Yeah,
difficult to have.
when someone's safe, and you could
Mm,
think, oh yeah, that sounds like a nice idea. We don't need a celebrant. We'll just gather everyone together. We'll just gather everyone together and tell stories. But the fact is, you're unlikely to do it. First of all, you're unlikely to do it because you haven't booked anyone that's coming at 3 o'clock on Thursday, and then you'll just go
mm,
shopping instead because you don't want to face it, perhaps. Or everyone comes and you have too much champagne, and before you know it, everyone's going home and saying, well, we didn't really do what we set out to do. And there's a very good reason why you won't, because it's terrifying and no one wants to do it. And the real value of a celebrant or someone like myself is that we facilitate conversation. That's actually a large part of what we do,
mm,
is that turning up on the day and helping people, holding people's hands when they do the readings, meeting people at the door. It's all very valuable. But I think 95% of my work, honestly, I'm not exaggerating, is done by the time I get there. And what is so great, and somebody actually said to me that she thinks that the real value of a funeral is the storytelling and the processing, and the way that when someone comes into your house, the way I do, for 3 hours sometimes, and I sit with your dog on my lap and I walk around your garden and I see his favorite plants, and I see his photographs and his golf clubs and all the things, and I manage to get a sense of that person. I've even been into people's houses and they've said, we've got to show you her jewelry collection because it's just her.
mm,
So I'll be upstairs looking at the jewelry collection, the beads, the scarves, everything that she's worn. And the dog
mm.
is usually on my lap. And then you just spend all of this time sharing those stories, but it takes a professional, a skilled professional. I mean, I've been doing this for 11 years to tease those stories out, the important bits, the little nuggets of gold, and to get an objective sense of the whole of a person. And what's beautiful about funerals as well, which is being lost if we don't have them, is that we don't hear different perspectives of our person. So you may be widowed and thinking that you knew them in a particular way, and you will know from the funeral that there were aspects of your spouse that were nothing like the person you knew,
Yeah.
or stories about them that you'd never heard. And that's something I hear all the time. I'm so glad I went to that funeral because I did not know that Bill used to be in amateur dramatics, and I didn't know that Marjorie swam the channel, and I didn't know that she took up Reiki when she was 85. And these are all real examples. So you get to hear these fabulous things, and of course we forget all the things that we've done with our lives. So having a professional there at a set time and a set date, and you've paid them to be there, means that you make the most of those 3 hours, and you
Yeah.
get the food in, you get everything in, you sit down, and you
Mm,
are kind of forced into sharing the things that you really want to share. So it's very empowering. It's an advocate role, really. I think I'm an advocate for people
mm.
to voice the things that they need to voice. It's very much about having your voice heard.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I say it a lot when emotions are high, intellect is low. And these are very emotional times, and being able to hear what people are saying, those that you love, it is difficult. And you're there, like you say, to provide that safe space and to take it all in and really hear what's being said. Um, in a place where you're not in that emotional state, so you're able to guide the conversation and tease out of people the important things, I suppose, that they're going to want to
Mm.
remember and carry forward. So I think
Mm.
that's so lovely. I love what you do, Jess. It's so interesting, and your stories are just fantastic. They really are, and I know you do so much more. And I love your Instagram. It's so bright, and it's so if you saw your Instagram page, you would never in a million years think, God, she's a funeral celebrant, because it's very uplifting, and it's full of color. I think last time I spoke to you, you had bright red hair. Now you've got blonde hair with pink stripes through it. You are all about the color, all the time, which is just lovely. And I think I when I was looking through your Instagram, you had a strap line in one of your posts, and it said, "Be the star of your last hurrah." And I just thought, oh my goodness, how lovely is that? That's just because it is your last hurrah, isn't it? It's that last points in your life where something is going to be solely about you, unless of course you decide further down the line to have a ceremony of sorts. You touched on it earlier, that you can absolutely, a year, 18 months, 2 years down the line, you can still have a ceremony of sorts if you want to. And I don't think people are necessarily aware of that, more so now, I think, since COVID, because people have done it. But your funeral is your last hurrah, isn't it? And I think
Yeah.
to be able to be the star of it and absolutely create something that reflects, I suppose, you and the life that you lived, and the person that you were, not your roles or your labels, but who you were at your core, what you stood for, what you valued, and how you lived your life. And I think you give people the ability to do that, and that is a real gift. And I think you've got a podcast, haven't you, coming out soon, Jess, if anybody wants to listen into that.
Well,
What's your podcast?
it's called Opening Ceremony, and it's all about how we tell human story through ceremony in a nutshell. But I love it. I get to have conversations like this. And you're right about what I'm doing is about distilling the essence of a person and
Mm.
giving them one last round of applause. It's
Yeah,
a round of applause for that human life having been lived.
yeah,
And that's
yeah,
so important. I mean, I could go on and on, but so my podcast is Opening Ceremony. It's my big passion. I love it. And anybody that wants to, who thinks that they might have a story to tell around this, do get in touch with me and we'll see what we can do, because I want it to be the stories of people, real life stories, not celebrities, not big
yeah,
famous people. I want it to be people like you and I, because I've
yeah,
spent so long listening to the stories of
yeah,
ordinary
yeah,
people, and also, funnily enough, people who want all this colour and life. I've had internationally renowned MPs, I've had High Court judges, I've had the whole range of people. And it's not necessarily true either that older people want something staid and stuffy.
yeah.
Quite often get people in their 80s and 90s. There was one time when I didn't have the pink hair, and this friend of mine, Kobe, I'd done a funeral for her husband. And she said, "Where's your pink hair? I want your pink hair back." And so 85-year-olds, when you think about when they were born, when you really think about it, people of any age might want colour. People of any age might want bright and vivacious and spontaneous and a bit more, less solemn, less formal. especially people born in the 60s. So it is something to bear in mind that you might not want someone stuffy and wearing a Barclays Bank suit. Anyway, thanks for reminding me about being the star of your last hurrah, because I'd actually, listeners, forgotten that I'd written that. So there you go. Sometimes you need someone outside of yourself to remind you of the things that you've done. Very clever.
Happens to me all the time. People say, "Oh, you said this." Did I say that?
I know, it's weird. That's good though.
It is, and I think it's brilliant. It should absolutely be a strap line of yours, because it's wonderful, and it just kind of brings a smile to your face, at a time when it can be a really difficult time for people. But knowing that, like you say, it doesn't have to be dark and stuffy, and it doesn't have to follow all the rules that we feel that it has to follow. There's so much more. So Jessica, it is just Jessica May on Instagram, I think, isn't it?
So on Instagram, I'm Crazy Diamond's Funeral Queen at the moment.
That's it.
Yes, that's it,
yes.
Isn't it? Crazy Diamond's Funeral Queen. Because I had so many people ask me for Shine On You Crazy Diamond from Pink Floyd. Yeah, I'll just check it in case we've got the wrong thing. I have all the old rockers come to me. Crazy Diamond's Funeral Queen. It's so long-winded that even I don't remember it, so I think we might be changing that. But I'm all over the internet as Jess May or Jess May Special Days, and you'll find me all over the show. The woman with the hair.
The woman with the hair, the bright colours. It's wonderful. Thank you so much. As you say, we could talk about it for hours. But I really appreciate you coming on and sharing all of your wisdom with us, Jess, and just helping us understand a little bit more what we can do for our loved ones and what we can maybe do for ourselves as well, thinking about our own funerals. So thank you, Jess. You're a star.
Loved it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to the Widow podcast with me, Karen Sutton. If you would like to be part of a supportive community of people who understand your grief, come and join my free Facebook group, Widowed and Rising. And make sure you tune in to the next episode of the Widow podcast.